We have finished off with the preseason, and it's on to talking about what we're looking at heading into the regular season. I'm going to talk about what it looks like with the Ticats depth chart and their cuts heading into at the end of it. And let's talk about the cuts first. Probably the most surprising was offensive lineman Casey Blazer getting cut. There was a lot of talk about him being possibly a starting right tackle for the team if they went with the 3 import offensive linemen setup, which they have not done, and in fact have only kept 2 import linemen. It's very weird. Very weird. Hopefully there is intentions to pick up some tackles, specifically because we don't really have any Canadian tackles, and you have Tony Washington and the injury-prone Riker Matthews as your 2 starters, which we'll talk about more. So hopefully there's a plan in regards to that. So that was definitely the most surprising thing. I thought there were a couple of other surprising things just because of how well they played in the preseason. Shakir Ryan did not make the team. He looked like a good option as a kick returner. And he's out of the question, as is Willie Quinn III, speaking of kick returners, and a guy who I thought was going to be a part of the running back core as well, because we also got rid of Storm Johnson. So we're in a very, very weird place in that regard with import running back. Basically, it's just down to Alex Green, which is fine. I thought Green was going to be the starter, obviously, but it's a bit weird that we're going into the season with him and Thomas Ellering and Mercer Timmis as our options in the backfield, but we'll talk more about that in a second as well. I also thought Akeem Wonder played pretty well in the preseason, so to see him get cut is a little disappointing. I thought additionally another guy who got cut, but I kind of wanted to see what he had, was Jacob Scarfone, but with there only being one starting non-import receiver by the looks of it, that's not a huge concern or a shock in hindsight. So let's talk about the team for a second. Of course, you have to have 7 non-import starters, so we'll talk about where they're going to fit in, and we'll talk about who the potential starters are, because I think it's an interesting group. So on the defensive line, we'll probably break it down into 2 import starters, 2 non-import starters, and I think it'll be Justin Capicotti and Ted Laurent for the Canadian side, and Adrian Tracy, and a combination of Jason Neal and Nikita Whitlock at the other defensive tackle spot. Other notable names in there, I think, are going to be Canadians Connor McGow, who I thought played very well actually in the preseason, and Justin Vaughn, who made a lot of big step-ups last season, and I think largely is a guy who made some of the other people like Evan Gill in the offseason expendable, so he'll probably be Laurent's primary backup and platoon mate. We talked about Whitlock, obviously, and I think Julian Hauscher, who played very well in the preseason, will be Adrian Tracy's backup and platoon mate. I think that's a lot of good depth on the defensive line. I think there's a lot you can do with that, and it makes up for the fact that we got rid of Davon Coleman and we got rid of Evan Gill in the offseason. So I think having the depth to make up for that is impressive, despite not really bringing anyone in, because, I mean, of course, Hauscher's new, but the other 7 are returning players, and that just highlights the strength of the defensive line in recent time. Linebacking core is a lot more interesting. Now, I assume we will not be having a Canadian starter, even though I think that would not be a bad idea, because I thought Terrell Davis played very well in the preseason. I thought Curtis Newton played reasonably well, and you have Nick Shorthill, who I think could be a guy to put in there. But it's not really needed, and we do have a tremendous depth in the secondary, so probably we'll have a defensive back in the form of Dodd Udamba or Damon Washington or Kirill Brooks or Mario Cooper playing that spot, alongside, of course, returnees Larry Dean and Simone Lawrence. That's probably the front 7 right there, and the secondary is a very deep one as well, with returnees Cooper, Brooks, and Unamba and Washington, Courtney Stevens back there, along with Mike Daly, Jay Langa as the 3 Canadians, and of course Richard Leonard, or Richard Leonard, however you want to say it, who was a breakout star in the secondary last season, and I think a couple of newcomers also may have some roles to play, and that's Jamal Roll and Frankie Williams, who I think both had very solid runs as well. Interestingly enough, we kept Wadood, but he's on the practice roster, so that's a bit weird. Anyways, I project the starters to be Rawle, Leonard, Courtney Stevens, Damod Washington, and Mario Cooper. That's my thoughts anyways. That's who I think it'll be. And then I think either Unamba or Cariel Brooks will be the linebacker. I think Mike Daly will get some time back there too. That's another option. Of course, you could do double Canadian starters with Courtney Stephen moving up to the corner, playing kind of a position that he has played before and is quite good at. But we seem to fancy him as a safety in this day and age, and not really wanting to invest in a Canadian starter that we can't necessarily replace, because his most ideal replacement would be Mike Daly, who's really a safety and would be probably the starting safety if Courtney Stephen were to start at the corner. So that's what the secondary probably looks like. Interesting enough, Abdul Kanay gone after a really unimpressive 2017 due to some injuries, but we let him go, cutting some cash in that regard. So 3 Canadian starters probably will be Capicotti, Laurent, and Steven, and we're probably going to have 4 starters on offense, and we're going to get into that right now. Of course, at quarterback, you've got Jeremiah Masoli, Johnny Manziel, Dane Evans as the 3 surviving guys. I thought Dane Evans looked really good when he came in against Montreal, but he was underwhelming against the Argos. Still, he's the most interesting of the prospects we had in camp, which were Vernon Adams and Brian Monitz, and probably he is the best fit for the 3rd role. Young, interesting prospect, and of course, you got Manziel and Masoli out in front of him. It'll be interesting to see if Manziel ends up being a starter, because the coaching staff definitely does like him. They took a big risk in bringing him here, as much as some people talked about that not being a risk. I think it absolutely is, because I think it could potentially fracture the locker room to a degree, and we know Manziel is not going to want to sit on the bench. He's going to make noise. He's had an attitude problem in the past, and people like he's saying all the right things now. Yeah, but he's also said all the wrong things before coming here. That he didn't want to come to Canada, that he wanted big starter money. I think anyone who thinks that he's going to be happy on the bench is probably kidding themselves. Joining the quarterback in the backfield, of course, we said Alex Green. You also have Mercer Timmis and Thomas Ellering on there as 2 non-import options. Not really sure what the deal with that is. I mean, I guess that's possibly to run double back setups and replace Mike Jones in the receiving corps, which we'll talk about in a second. But I'm not really sure how that's going to go. 4 import receivers, I think, is the way to go. Jalen Saunders, Brandon Banks, Luke Tasker, and Terrence Tolliver. Notably, we are only carrying one other one, which is Bryce Wilkerson, who I think will probably play some level of role in the return game. Also, you have Mike Jones, as I said, probably is the Canadian starter, because a lot of the other Canadians haven't really panned out. You have the season-ending injury to Shamad Chambers, the fact that we have not re-signed Mark Chapman, or we have not signed Mark Chapman, and then we basically have Felix Faubert-Lucier, who's kind of a special team specialist, who will probably be playing behind him. I have some significant concerns about Jones, as I've had for a number of seasons. The man is very fast, but he does not have very good hands. He's not a very precise route runner, doesn't read the defense very well, and of course had a recent PED suspension. There's a lot of baggage there, and I'm not really sure if he's a terribly redeemable receiver. I kind of compare him to Chris Bauman of a couple of years ago, when Bauman had a basically constant flaw, which was he didn't really fight for the ball. He was a reasonably fast guy, reasonably big guy, had okay route running ability, and actually not terrible hands. But he was very easy to contest because he had been so used to, I think, in college, being so much larger than the guys covering him that they just couldn't do anything about it. In the CFL, people could, and that led him to being relatively a bust of a draft pick. Anyways, not that Mike Jones has identical problems to that, because he's not a particularly big receiver, but I think he's used to being very, very fast, much faster than the guys around him, and that's not really the case in pro ball, and it's kind of shown so far, so here's hoping, anyways, that he comes up with a big season. Then on the offensive line, as I said, we've only got 2 imports, and that's the tackles Tony Washington and Riker Matthews. Riker Matthews had a lot of injury problems last season, so I'm hoping there's a plan to get some depth in the position. That's also why I thought Casey Blazer getting cut was by far the biggest surprise of training camp and the preseason. He is a tackle that they were relatively high on as possibly even replacing Riker Matthews at the right tackle position. To have him cut, I think, is not a great idea unless he was demanding a lot more money than I think he was. But as a guy who I believe had only spent 1 year in the CFL, I can't imagine he was a big contract. So it's a very weird case that he was cut and there wasn't really any replacements in mind. Like I said, hopefully there's a plan to bring some people in during the season to deepen up the American offensive line spots, because right now it is paper thin. In terms of the starters in the middle, Mike Filer is probably a lock at center, as is Brandon Revenberg, a very promising offensive lineman at left guard. The interesting thing is, of course, the Ryan Bomden spot. Now, a lot of people, when Bomden got traded, that was the speculation that there would possibly be an American right guard starter and a double import or non-import Canadian receiving core, possibly a linebacker as well. That didn't pan out. It's definitely going to be a Canadian starting there, and the question is, which one? If I had my picks, it would be Darius Shirako. I thought he was the best player on the line during the preseason. I think he earned the starting role. That being said, he doesn't have a lot of experience, and you have to think that maybe guys who are more senior on the team, like Brett Golding and Landon Rice, might have the inside track to that role. That being said, I've been pretty chronically unimpressed with Landon Rice and Brett Golding throughout their careers so far. The idea of them being a starting right guard for this team is a little bit troubling. I would think that you had a better plan in place than those two when you dealt away Bomden, and I'm hoping that it is Darius Shirako. There's also Brendan Schramm in the mix, and of course, out of retirement, Matthew Girard made the team, but I think Girard will probably play on the backup center role, as he's not really terribly suited to the guard position. Additionally, there's also Canadians Kay Okafor and Everett Williams on the team. They're more tackles, though, which will probably be the backups there. Very stacked Canadian quantity on the line, even if I don't necessarily know about the quality. I mean, I'm a big fan of Filer and Revenberg, but not necessarily the rest. So how does this team stack up overall? I think overall this is a slightly weaker team than last season started. Now, that being said, there's some young players who could definitely develop further here, and if the secondary can remain healthy for a change, because the last couple of seasons have seen some drastic injuries in the secondary, then you could probably see this team be a little bit better if it can be healthy. Receiving core also got banged up last season with the loss of Terrence Tolliver, so him staying healthy would be key, along with the developing star Jalen Saunders, as well as Tasker and Banks, of course, in the mix. Alex Green, I think, gives us a better runner than CJ Gable, but not necessarily an overall better back. I thought Gable was chronically underrated during his time here. I thought we didn't use him very well because we did not run the ball. We did not run the ball in any creative ways. It was a very predictable time. That being so, I think he was chronically underrated. I think that the offensive scheme, of course, is a lot better. We saw that come into play last season when Ken Austin was relieved of duty as head coach. And we got June Jones brought in to be the caller, or the head coach. You also have Orlando Steinauer back with the team, although he is not in the defensive coordinator role, which is interesting. So we'll see how that plays out over the course of the season. I think overall, we didn't really add a ton in the offseason, but we didn't really need a ton. We needed more stability in the front office. We needed to actually just have a season where we're executing the same system throughout. Case in point, not a lot of the starters on the team are new. We're going to have a right guard starting change, but it's going to be probably guys who are on the roster already. The receiving core is more just incorporating Terrence Tolliver back from injury than anything else. And on the defensive side of the ball, I think Ramal Roll is probably your only new starter, as well as, depending on who ends up with the role in the outside linebacker role. It's a bunch of guys who came in last season and did a really good job, in Leonard, Brooks, and Cooper, as well as Unamba, and, of course, returning mainstays Courtney Stephen and DeMond Washington. Along with, of course, Simone Lawrence and Larry Dean in the linebacking core. And really the same starting line as last season with one change, that being the departure of Devon Coleman. So I can't really say that the team is better in terms of personnel. Player personnel, I should say. But definitely I think having the coaching staff in place will lead to a better team. And I like the prospects are pretty good. I think that we're competitive with the Argos and the Red Blacks, and I don't think that Montreal has solved the problems that plagued them for the last couple of seasons. Should be a decent playoff run for the Ticats this season. So heading into the regular season, that things look pretty bright, although there is some intrigue, some things that could go wrong. The Manziel situation, like I said, we do definitely have a lack of talent at the import offensive line spots, but I think it's going to be a good season, and I hope you guys enjoy it. I'll talk to you after week 1.